Good evening, everybody. Welcome to another edition of our Kosher Curiosities series where we tackle halachic kosher curiosities. And we've been going now for the 12 straight classes, and this is our 13th installment. And we are in the middle of Basar Bechalav, milk and meat. This is our second installment of the milk and meat part of this series. And wow, is this going to be a very important one. Today we're going to speak about separating meat and milk utensils, having meat utensils, dairy utensils. What happens if they get mixed up? What about Parve utensils? These are all things that we're going to talk about today and more in the upcoming week. So we're just going to get right into it. We are studying from Pnei Halacha, Rabbi Eliezer Melamed, in 25th chapter, Halacha Vav. Here he says, "Harotzeh le'echol basar al shulchan she'achlu alav chalav o lefech." If somebody wants to eat on a table meat which was already had milk on it, meaning someone ate milk on that table, tzarich lenakot et hashulchan misheyareh hama'achal hakodem. A person has to clean that table from any residue of milk. Ubelo zot asur le'echol hashulchan tamin hasheni. And if you did not clean that table from the previous food, then you would not be allowed to eat on that table. So if you want to eat meat on a table that dairy was eaten, you have to clean off all the dairy, and vice versa the same way as well. And as well, you have to also clean a tablecloth, not just a tablecloth. Also, if there was previous food of the opposite kind on it. If your tablecloth is of a material that really absorbs food, let's say it's just got absorbing quality, it might have absorbed milk or meat grease, yesh lekabesa, person needs to make sure he's got to clean and launder that tablecloth. Let's say it's made out of plastic that does not absorb. A person can just wipe it down with a wet cloth. Even when we are makpid today, nowadays, to eat on plates, a person has to make sure to clean the table between meat and milk. Lechem shehugash b'seuda besarit. If a person ate bread in a meat meal, im yesh chashash savir shenagu bo b'yadayim shesh alehem shuman or rotev besari, if we're worried that someone might have touched the bread with their greasy meat hands, en leagisho b'seuda halavit, a person should not bring that bread to the dairy meal. Kedish lo yavo lechol shiareh basarim chalav v'chen lefech. So not to eat from that bread now that is meat, because got meat grease on it with your dairy foods, and the same would apply the opposite way. But if you were eating bread with meat meal, but you were sure and positive that you did not eat from that bread and grease the bread with meat, oil or grease, mutar le'ochlo barucha halavit, you would be allowed to eat the bread with milk or dairy meal. Salatim. Sometimes you have these dip salads, you got your matbucha, your baba ganoush, your hummus that you were eating with your meat meal. If there is a worry that those that were eating from the meal may have dipped their forks or their spoons that may have meat residue in the hummus or in the matbucha, you should not serve those same salads in a dairy meal, and the same would apply the other way around. Sometimes if you have the salads have their own spoons reserved for them, and we're not worried that someone may have taken from his own spoon filled with meat and dipped it into the hummus, then in that case, you would be allowed to serve them in a dairy meal. However, some people are very strict, even lechatchila, that any foods whatsoever that were served on a meat meal should not be served again on a dairy meal. And even those who are mehadrim, Rashaim, b'shat hatzorech le'akel. If they really need to, they could be mekil, they could be lenient. Kozman shen chashash sabir shenidbeku she'arei chalav o basar b'salat o balechem. When we know for sure there was no meat or milk that got stuck onto those salads or onto the bread. Kefi shelamadu, like we've learned, be'et achilat basar asur she'yeh ala shulchan chalav. We've already learned in the halacha gima, we learned this in meat and milk part 1, that when you are eating meat, you cannot have on your table any dairy products, or the other way around. lest you make a mistake and eat them together. But if you are not eating, then you are allowed to have your jug of milk and your brisket on the same table, as long as you're not eating. You can have meat and milk in your backpack, or in your drawer, or in your fridge, as long as you make sure that they don't touch each other. What happens if they do touch each other? Oh no, do we got to throw it out in the garbage? No, you don't. If they did touch, you just need to rinse off the area where they touch, and you can continue to eat that food. Now, with that said, don't put milk in an area that it could drip onto meat. Okay, because you don't want to put yourself in that predicament. But if it did, all you need to do is rinse off the milk from the meat. You don't need to throw the meat into the garbage. There's nothing wrong with the meat. It's still kosher because it wasn't cooked. It's cold milk dripping on meat. All you need to do is rinse it off. That's actually a very big kosher curiosity. A lot of people get very scared when they hear about dairy food, touch of meat food, they throw everything out. You don't need to. You would actually be doing worse. Throwing out very, very good food. Don't do that. Just rinse it off and continue eating. Now, let's talk about utensils and separating utensils. This is actually going to lead to next week as well. In a kitchen where we prepare meat foods and dairy foods, we need to have separate utensils, meat and milk. And we should have some sort of difference between them. You want to do red for meat, black for dairy, or vice versa, whatever. We don't want people to switch them by accident. We should have utensils, knives, forks, spoons for dairy and meat, and also have a difference between them, a noticeable difference. Also, we have a separate drawer. We have a drawer for the meat spoons and the meat forks, and we have a drawer for the dairy spoons and the dairy forks. And even if you are eating cold meat or cold dairy foods, the custom among the Jewish people is to still use the appropriate utensils. So meaning what this is talking about, if you are making an iced coffee, for example, cold iced coffee, or something, a cold drink, could be a smoothie of some sort, and that smoothie is dairy. Now, if it's dairy and it's cold does not transfer any taste. So halachically, you are allowed to take a meat spoon in this cold smoothie and stir up your smoothie, or eat your smoothie with a meat spoon. There's nothing wrong halachically with it. However, the minhag of Yisrael is not to do so, lest a person mix up the utensils and they'll forget. So therefore, you're drinking your smoothie, even if it's cold, make sure that you're using a dairy spoon. There are many people have the custom to use 2 salt jars or 2 salt shakers, meat and milk. Why is this? Sometimes the salt jar will touch the food, or your hands are greasy and it will touch the salt shaker. And if you use that for 2 different types of foods, meat and milk, maybe lest it touch the other food, and that could be a problem. And if you do want to use just 1 salt shaker or salt jar, make sure that it's clean. And if it did get dirty, just make sure to clean it. Or ketchup. Let's say you want to use a bottle like ketchup, and you like to squeeze your ketchup on meats. I don't know why anyone would do that, but let's say you do that. Some people like ketchup on everything, or on your French fries that may have touched meat or some sort. You use this ketchup for your fries and grilled cheese for dairy, or your ketchup with your meat. You have to make sure that this lid of the ketchup doesn't touch the actual food. Because if it touches the steak, then you got meat residue on it, and then you're going to go put it on your grilled cheese or on your pizza. That's not good. להקפיד שלא לנגוע בכלים עליו בידיים שדבוק בהן שמץ רטיבות או של מאכלי בשר או חלב. You also make sure your hands are clean. You're squeezing the bottle, touching the lid. You don't want your greasy, cheesy hands from pizza touching the ketchup bottle. Okay, now it's got some cheese grease on it, and now you're going to use that later to squirt on your steak. Not good. Again, not good to squirt ketchup on your steak anyways. And if you were not makpid on this, a person needs to make sure that the mouth of the ketchup bottle or any bottle of barbecue sauce or whatnot is clean, so that any taste doesn't get transferred. Now, what about a high chair for a child? Okay, children, their young toddler age, are sitting on a high chair, and you got their tray. What's the status with that tray? Another big question I get asked often. Magash shel kisei tinok. If you have a tray of a high chair, since generally we don't put food on that tray that is piping hot, that's yad soledet bo, that's the temperature where if you were to touch it with your finger, your hand would shoot back because out of the shocking pain of heat. And the reason why we don't do that is because we don't want to burn the child. We're not worried that this plastic tray is going to absorb both meat and milk. All you need to do is wipe down the tray in between the meals. Let's say you do put piping hot food in front of your little toddler. I don't know why you would do that, but let's say you did. Then you have to ensure that you have two separate trays. One of them meat, one of them dairy. And if you want to put from the second type, and let's say you put very hot spaghetti and meatballs onto the tray, and now you don't have another tray. So what do you need to do? You have to make sure that if you're going to put dairy on that tray, that A has to be clean, and B has to be cold food and not hot food. Okay, good. Let's talk about parve food. Says the Pnei Halacha. Machal parve hu machal sheno chalavi v'no besari. Parve food is food that is not dairy or meat. Lechatchila yesh lishmor hafrada ben haminim. Lechatchila, a person should make sure to separate the types. V'kasher mitkavnim lechol machalav parvim basar. If someone wants to eat parve food with meat, lebashnem besid besarim. Make sure to cook those potatoes. We'll use potatoes as an example tonight. Make sure to cook your potatoes in a meat pot if you're going to be eating those potatoes with your goulash. V'kasher mitkavnim lechol hamim yachad. But if you're going to eat those potatoes with your pizza, lebashnem besid chalavi. Make sure to make those potatoes in a dairy pot. V'zot, the reason is kedei limnoa bilbul, in order to prevent any type of mixture, because if you do mix them up, you might think that you might make the mistake and think that this meat food is parve, and you'll come to eat it with chalav, and then God forbid you're actually eating basar v'chalav. And also, we're worried maybe you didn't clean the pots properly. That could be a problem. Maybe these potatoes could have absorbed some of that meat flavor in the pot that you didn't clean properly. Now the potatoes are going to turn into meat, or chalavi, or dairy, because you didn't clean the dairy pot properly, and you're going to now eat it with something else. Okay, so generally, if you want to make your potatoes with your meat goulash, make sure you make the potatoes in a meat pot. If you want to make your potatoes with a pizza or dairy omelet or whatnot, then make sure you make your potatoes in a dairy pot. Omnam, however, בשעת הצורך, in times of need, מותר לבשל מאכל פרווה בסיד מתכת או זכוכית בשר נקי כדי לאכלו אחר כך עם חלב או להפך. In times of need, guess what? You are able to make your potatoes in a meat pot if you're going to eat those potatoes with dairy, as long as it's clean, as long as it's glass, a clean metal. כמו כן מותר בשעת הצורך לחתוך מאכלים חליפים כדוגמת בצל ושום. And also in times of need, you're allowed to cut sharp vegetables such as onions and garlic בסכין מתכת בשרית שנוקתה היטב, with a very clean meat knife, עבור תבשיל חלבי או להפך, and you're going to be eating that with with dairy or a dairy dish. However, יש מחמירים ואוסרים לאכול עם חלב מאכל פרווה שבושל בשר בשרי או להפך. However, there are those who are מחמיר not to do so. אולם, כיוון שברור מעבר לכל ספק, since we want to be clear of any ספק, שאחר שמנקים כלי זכוכית ומתכת עם סבון, if you're cleaning the glass utensil, and we're going to get to glass later on when we talk about different types of kelim, if you clean the glass, your Pyrex, or your metal with soap, guess what happens when you clean with soap? Hem enam portim ta'amim. They do not no longer emit these type of tastes. Therefore, halacha kedat hamekilim. The halacha is like those who are lenient. Aval im bishut ma'achala parva b'ktila shel matechet or zechuchit besarit or chalavit. Let's say you cooked your potatoes in a meat or dairy glass pot. Shelo niku etev im sabon. You did not clean well. There was still dairy residue on that pot or meat residue on that pot. Now the poskim argue, can I now eat this parve potatoes that now may have absorbed dairy residue? Now can I eat these potatoes with meat? And same thing if I make these potatoes in an earthenware vessel, also do I have a problem? But even if I were to clean the utensil well with soap, but if it's made out of earthenware, then we have a problem, because made out of earthenware, it absorbs very much. The poskim argue. So he brings out a note over here that I'm going to read. I normally don't read his notes, but I'm going to read it here because I think it's very important. He says this, he says, Bekitur, shalosh deot bedin zeh. There are three opinions in this matter based on what we said over here, cooking par foods in a meat vessel or a dairy vessel, and to eat it with the opposite food. So he said, Minhag chelek miyotze Sfarad, some Sfaradim, apir of Yosef Karo, mutar lechatchila. Right, lechatchila, right, primarily, a person can do this, no problem. Levashe bekli besari ben yomo. A person can even take potatoes with a meat pot that he cooked meat last night, within 24 hours. He could take potatoes, take the potatoes, cook in that meat pot, and then eat dairy right afterwards, or vice versa. Not a problem. Okay, but there's only a small amount of Sfaradim do that. Most Sfaradim follow the second opinion, which the Shulchan Aruch brings down. A person is not allowed to cook potatoes in a meat pot that was just used within 24 hours, to now eat with dairy foods because it's within 24 hours. You cannot do that lechatchila. B'di'avad, it would be fine. B'di'avad means if, let's say, you didn't realize or was by accident, then the food is still kosher. However, v'imakli eno ben yomo mutar. But if the vessel has not been used within 24 hours, then nothing wrong with it. Because if it's not within 24 hours, anything that is absorbed becomes pagum, as we're going to learn later on in this series, becomes spoiled. So your potatoes aren't absorbing anything. Even though it's a meat pot, it's not absorbing any meat because it hasn't been used in so long. And therefore, you could use this with and eat it with dairy products. That's how most Sfaradim hold. More lenient than the third opinion, the Ashkenazim. Even if you have a meat pot that you haven't used in a week, you cannot prepare your potatoes in that pot to now eat with dairy. However, he does say, let's say you didn't know, and you made a mistake, then you could eat it. And if the pot was within 24 hours, according to Ashkenazim, can never be mekil. Alright, so these are the three opinions that he brings down. Let's talk about cutting boards. If you have a cutting board made out of wood, or of plastic, sofek ta'amim, that absorbs flavor. לפיכך, יש לייחד קרש מיוחד למאכלים בשריים וקרש מיוחד למאכלים חלביים. You should make sure you have a meat cutting board and a dairy cutting board. ומי שרוצה לחתוך מאכלים שני המינים, someone wants to cut two types of foods, צריך לייחד גם קרש למאכל פרווה. You should have also parve. בדיעבד, let's say, after the fact, אם חתכו ירקות הקרש חיתו בשרי, שניקו אותו היטב, let's say you cut your peppers on a meat cutting board, but you clean that very well. And then you mix them up with a dairy dish. Hatafshil kasher. The tafshil is kosher. Your dish is kosher. But if, let's say, the vegetables you cut were like onions or garlic, כדוגמת בצל, ולא היה בתבשיל פי 60 כנגד הבצל, but you didn't have in your dish 60 times the amount of onions, יש לאסור את התבשיל באכילה, you have to prohibit this dish, שמדרך הבצל נכנס באותם בשר, because the onion, being that sharp, absorbed meat flavor, and now you put it in your dairy dish, your small little mac and cheese that you made a little bit amount. It's not 60 times the amount of the onions. Therefore, you have to kind of throw it out. But he does bring an opinion. Situation where you really need it, you could be mekil. Okay. Even if a person wants to prepare cold par food, a person should still use one type of kli, either dairy or meat, in order to continue making a difference between the two. It gives an example. If someone is preparing par food in a meat pot, if you're going to stir that par food, stir it with a meat spoon. However, in times of need, let's say you are in a rush, you don't even have a clean meat spoon, and you need to stir this, you are allowed to stir the food with a dairy spoon. Now he talks about large kitchens or social dining halls or restaurants that have a lot of staff. You have these large kitchens with a lot of workers. So if we don't have rules established and protocols, now we have much more to worry about. Certainly, if many of the people working there don't keep mitzvot, such as the kitchens of the army, or dining social halls, bate malon, hotels, misadot, and restaurants. Person has to make sure they have much more protocols and rules and people watching over these places more than you have at home. We have special te'udot. They make sure to ensure that everything is up to halachic standards. Now, what about these parve utensils? Are they necessary or not? מצד הדין, אין צורך להחזיק כלי פרווה, כי גם כאשר רוצים לבשל מאכל פרווה ולאכול חלקו עם בשר וחלקו עם חלב, אפשר לבשל בסיס מתך בשרי או חלב נקי. He's saying, and according to halacha, you don't need to have parve utensils. You don't need to have parve dishes or parve pots or parve spoons and forks, because, like we said, you can just cook it in your meat pot if you're going to be eating with meat, so on and so forth, and that's it. Because he does say that many people do have parve utensils. Okay? And because sometimes you might want to keep things separate. One of the reasons why they do it, maybe we not clean the meat dishes, the meat pots properly, or the dairy pots properly, and now you're left over with this taste that might go into your par food. So nowadays, why is there a lot of people have parve kelim? Simple. Because the cost of pots and pans today is very cheap. You can go on Amazon, go to Walmart, get a whole set of pots for $49.99. I don't know, $69.99. You guys have a brand new set of pots. So it's a lot cheaper than it was. So what's the big deal to have another set of pots? Okay, you might have some people do this. However, mineged, opposite this, there's some people said, no, I'm purposely not getting parve utensils because things could get mixed up. Right? A person is not makpid to mix up certain things. We don't know where these things are going to be cleaned. Are they going to be cleaned with meat pots? Are they going to be cleaned with dairy pots? It's a whole extra layer of confusion, and therefore it's unnecessary, and therefore many people say we don't need parve pots. Let's say a person does own a set of parve pots. Let's say they cooked meat in their parve pots. Oh no, now what? I cooked meat in my parve pots. No problem. You just need to kosher the kli with hagala that's putting into boiling water, okay? And now it goes back to its state of parv. If now boiling milk comes into the pot or boiling meat, you just wipe the spot where the boiling milk hit the pot, and then you pour onto it boiling water in order to retain the status of parv. According to the law, a person is allowed to take his parv utensils and clean them in the meat sink with meat utensils, or the dairy sink with dairy utensils. And they stay parv. However, if you have a dishwasher or a cleaner that is very, very disgusting, that has a lot of residue and grease left over, then don't put your parve utensils in there. Same thing with regards to the sink. If you leave there, your pot soaking in water, hot water for a day or more, don't put your parve utensils in there. This is one of the problems that can come up with parve kelim. That's why a lot of people, they own parve kelim, they want to make sure that it is kept separate. Last thing we're going to learn today is certain mistakes that can happen in the kitchen. If you're cooking your potatoes in a meat pot, don't stir it with a milk pot, with a milk spoon, and the other way around. If you did make a mistake, if the pot and the spoon were made out of metal, and they were clean before the start of the cooking process, don't worry, your food is still kosher. And not only that, your spoon doesn't need to be kosher because you're stirring a parve food, potatoes. If a person made a mistake and he stirred this meat tafshil with a metal dairy spoon, or the other way around, if, let's say, the spoon was clean, then after the fact, your food is kosher. Still kosher. What are you talking about? There's dairy spoon, I stirred meat. Still kosher. Relax. Because the spoon was clean, so nothing was emitted from the spoon into the pot. But you need to kosher the spoon now. You need to kosher the spoon with hagala, dipping boiling water. Because now it was used with boiling milk, boiling dairy, and boiling meat. Sometimes you have on your stove a meat dish on the fire and a dairy dish on the fire, or parve besir matechet chalavi, or a parve food in a dairy pot. If, let's say, you're making these meatballs, right, and something squirted out of the meatballs, okay, and landed on the walls of the dairy pot. Your dairy pot was boiling. It had over there some boiling cheese. I don't know, mac and cheese, something that you were making over there. Since it was boiling too, guess what? The whole pot requires you hagala to be kosher. But what's in it is kosher, because it didn't land in the food; it landed on the pot. So the pot needs to be kosher, but not the food inside. Because what squirted, the meatballs that squirted out of the pot, landed on the walls. But if the meatball squirt landed on the cold walls of a milk pot, since it was cold, only the layer of the outside of the pot absorbed. I don't need to kosher the whole entire dairy pot. I only need to pour hot water on that spot that the meatball squirt landed. As is the rule, the way that it is absorbed, that's the way that it emits. And that's what we do. This is how we do it. We wipe off the meatball squirt from the dairy pot, and we pour hot water on that spot. We pour there lots of water. בשפע, בשיעור של פי 60 יותר מקליפת הבסיס במקום שעליו הלא ניתז, and more than 60 times that area where the squirt landed, וכשיש ספק אם יש מים פי 60 מקליפת הבסיס באותו מקום, מביאים מים במי סבון. And if you're not sure whether or not you put enough water there, then mix soap in the water. טעה וחתך בשר רותח בסכין מתכת חלבית. The person made a mistake and cut meat with a dairy knife. אם הסכין הייתה נקייה כמקובל, בשר כשר. If the knife was clean, the meat is kosher, no problem. But the meat needs, the knife needs to be koshered because you cut it while the meat was hot. But if the meat was cold, hasakin tzricha nikui tov, then the knife requires a good cleaning, but it does not require to be kosher. It's going to conclude tonight's class. Please come back next week, because next week we get to the big question about dishwashers. Do I need 2 sinks? Do I need 2 dishwashers? What about my stovetop? What about my ovens? What about my microwave? All these things we're going to speak about next week in the Meat and Milk Part 3. I hope you enjoyed Part 2. Wishing you a wonderful night.